Today we're taking inspiration from McGee & Co. to create some high-end home decor on a budget. First up, we have this Koa cement planter. At $24, that's not a terrible price for a 4-inch planter pot, but we can make this for a whole lot less with supplies I already have on hand. The McGee & Co. version also doesn't have a drainage hole, so it's just a cover pot. Here's the supplies I'm using to create the planter: a 4-inch nursery pot, white paint, plaster of Paris because I don't have any cement at the moment, and macrame cord. I started out painting the nursery pot by hand with a coat of gesso. Gesso is an acrylic paint primer. It helps paint stick to a more slick surface. I was gonna give the nursery pot a few coats of the gesso, but it was a little bit difficult to paint by hand because the pot is super flimsy. So instead I gave it one coat of the gesso and then I took it out to my garage to spray paint it. I'm currently out of white spray paint, so I used this tub and tile paint that the previous homeowner had left here. It's very old at this point, yet it still works okay, but the coverage isn't great. So for the third coat, I used my heirloom white spray paint. This step isn't entirely necessary. I wanted to make sure that you don't see that orange terracotta color underneath of the macrame and the plaster. Next, I'm gonna add the macrame cord all around the outside of the planter. This is a 3mm macrame cord. I would have preferred something thicker like the inspo image had. I think the Dollar Tree white nautical rope would have been a great alternative if you don't have macrame. The nautical rope would give you that chunkier look. Now, when you cut macrame, it tends to want to unravel. So to help that, I take the tip of my hot glue gun and I squeeze out just a tiny little amount of the glue onto the rope. Then I use the hot tip of the hot glue gun to spread the glue over the ends. This is going to cause them all to stick together, and once that glue dries, it becomes hard, so now they won't come unraveled. I also did not add hot glue to every inch of the nursery pot. I would wrap a little bit, add some glue, wrap a little more, add some glue, and so on. The plaster or the cement will help to hold everything in place later on. At the top, I went a little bit over the top of the nursery pot, that way you can't obviously see it. Then to end it, I cut the macrame cord and glued it down on the inside of the planter. Once there's a plant inside, you won't be able to see that end piece. And I do the same thing here at the top with the ends, gluing them in place so it doesn't fray. Next, for the plaster part, I'm mixing up 1 part of cold water to 2 parts of plaster in my silicone mixing cup. I used a half cup of water and 1 cup of plaster, and this was way too much. A 1/4 cup of water and a half a cup of plaster would have still been more than enough. But I love these silicone mixing cups because once you're done, just let the plaster dry. The dried plaster will easily pop out so the cups can be used over and over. The stir stick also wiggled right out as well. I always have these linked in my description box. Once the plaster is mixed up, you only have about 6 to 10 minutes to work with it before it starts to thicken and get hard. I'm using a sponge brush to apply the plaster all over the macrame cord. In the McGee & Co. inspo, it looked like there were areas where the cement covered the rope more than others. I tried to replicate that by building up the plaster in some sections. And that's it for this one. Add a plant to it, fake or real since we have those drainage holes. Next up, I found this beautiful Bronx oak pedestal, but at $120, I can definitely make this one for cheaper. Here's our supplies for this one, a 1x11 wood scrap, and I found this giant beaded garland at a thrift store months ago. I've just been holding on to them and waiting for the right project. Today's the day! I'm going to attempt to make a wood circle out of this scrap wood square using my jigsaw. I have seen people do this before and they make it look so easy. I need to create a template using a rectangular scrap wood board. I end up swapping this one out for a thin Dollar Tree rectangle wood blank, but I do the same process to it. I just wanted something a little bit thinner. But you first need to take the blade out of your jigsaw to see where it will sit on the wood board and mark that with a pencil. Then I'm taking a roller to get a straight line all the way down the board where I marked it for the blade. Here's where I swapped it out for the thinner board. I need to drill a hole big enough for the blade to fit comfortably through it, so I made my hole about a 1/2 inch. I also added a couple of pilot holes at 10.5 and 11 inches. This ends up being too big. I forgot that you want your pilot hole to be half of the diameter, so later I changed this to 5 inches. But it all just depends on how big of a circle you want to make. 11 inches would have created a 22-inch circle. There are a few ways you can attach the jigsaw to the board. You could screw it on. I didn't have long enough screws for that, so I used this double-sided foam tape from the Dollar Tree. This stuff is super strong and worked perfect for this project. I added a strip down both sides of my jigsaw feet and then placed it onto the board. Now, my first attempt wasn't great. I'm leaving it in here to show you. I wasn't thinking about how I needed the saw to be on the opposite side of the board because I'm right-handed. The way I set it up was for a left-handed person, so I struggled to get the board I was cutting to spin while guiding the jigsaw with my left hand. The circle isn't completely terrible, but definitely could be better. So I flipped the jigsaw around on the board to make it right-handed. Then I measured out where my center point on the circle would be, screwed the board down to the center of my scrap wood, and then I cut out a new circle. This one turned out so much better. It's a little off where I began and ended, but that's okay. Next, I'm going to sand it all down and we can smooth that out. I also rounded all of the edges with my sander to make it a little bit less sharp looking by taking my sander and rolling it back and forth over the sides. By no means is this a perfect circle, but I think it looks pretty darn good. And you can always use a wood circle from the hardware store to make this same project. Next, I'm going to stain my wood in the color Early American. This color looks pretty close to the McGee & Co. inspiration piece. When the stain dried, I can add the bead legs on. As I was getting the beads out, I realized they're not all the same size, and in fact, no two were really the same size at all. I tried all of the beads and nothing was working. There was a constant wobble from some of them not touching the wood at all. So I used my flexible tape measure to measure all of the beads from center hole to center hole, and I used the 4 that were closest in size. I thought about cutting the tops off to make sure that they were all the same height, but I wasn't really sure what the best way was to do that. Anyways, once I got 4 beads and no wobble, I marked where I wanted them to sit on the circle, and I measured how far in from the edge that was. This way I can make sure that all 4 beads sit in the same spot. I had them about a 1/2 inch in from the edge. Then I used wood glue to add them to the board, but I think E6000 would have also been a good choice because the beads are painted and not raw wood. They actually aren't wood at all. I tried sanding one of them to see, but they're MDF. Off camera, I did go back and add on a 5th beaded leg to make this look more like the inspiration, but that's it for this project. Would you ever attempt to cut out a wood circle yourself, or prefer to buy them pre-made at the hardware store? And this one is listed on my site. Next up is this Malibu bowl I found scrolling on McGee & Co. for $128. I thought it was so cool looking and that I would be able to make it with clay that I already have. Mine doesn't turn out exactly the same, but let's get into it. I bought this 10-pound slab of clay about a year ago and was worried that it might be dried out by now since I haven't used it much. But to my surprise, it was still workable. So I cut off a chunk to start rolling it out and conditioning it. I do think it was a little bit drier than it used to be, which made it a little bit harder to work with. Now, I am no expert when it comes to making ceramics or working with clay, but I do know that conditioning the clay is an important step. So I go back and forth, wedging it with my hands and then rolling it out with a rolling pin. When rolling clay, I make sure to keep flipping it to get a more even slab. You can use depth guides as well, but I just winged it. I am not putting this bowl in a kiln or using it for any type of food purposes. This is purely decorative, so I wasn't too concerned about it being the same thickness all the way around. I brought Luna's bed into the craft room and she loves hanging out in here with me, you guys. She has become my little shadow. Sometimes she does get a little bit wild though, especially when Big Brother Odin is around. Alright, once my slab is big enough, I grabbed a bowl from my kitchen that was the size I want my clay bowl to be, and I covered it with cling wrap. That way the clay doesn't suction to my glass bowl. I also added a tiny little bit of oil to the cling wrap. I really don't want this clay to stick. Now I can cover the bowl with my clay. You want the clay to be much larger than the bowl so you can get a smooth outcome without wrinkles in the clay. Then I just work the sides to shape it against the bowl form. I also used a rib tool. I got this in a very cheap clay kit from the craft store, but a credit card or something similar would work just as well. This is going to smooth out the surface, especially for my fingerprints or any bumpy areas. Once I was good with the bowl shape, I cut off that excess clay. But I didn't cut it right up against that bowl just yet. I'm going to flip the bowl over to cut right along the edge of it. At this point, the clay is still pretty wet and moldable, so I let it sit for a few hours to start drying. Now that the clay is a little bit more firm, I took the rib to it again. This time I dipped it in water to help smooth out those sides. And I did the inside as well now that I can get to it. You can see on the inside of the bowl, there's a line near the top. That's from the bowl I used as a form. Well, I got a little tear in my clay, so I decided to cut it down a little bit using that line as a guide. And then I smoothed out the rim with some water in my fingers. Next, I need to make the top decorative portion of the bowl. The best way I thought to do this was to grab some more clay, roll it out to make a 1-inch long rectangle, and shape it off of the bowl first. I cut slits in the clay at 1 inch apart, and I started to round the edges to separate the sides from each other. Now, the McGee & Co. inspiration piece looked like the decorative part was rounder, almost like it had little balls on top. I think I could have done this a little bit different and shaped individual balls and then added them onto the clay section, but I didn't think about that at the time while making this bowl, so mine turns out a little bit stiffer looking. Now I need to connect the two pieces together. When attaching clay pieces, you want to score and slip it. This scoring tool also came in that basic clay toolkit that I bought, but you can use anything to create little cuts in the clay. Then you want to add slip, which is just clay mixed with water. You do this on both pieces that you want to join together, and then you smooth out the seams until you can't tell that these were two separate pieces. Then just repeat this until the top rim of the bowl is attached, and since this is air dry clay, set it aside to dry. Now this bowl will not be able to hold water and is not food safe, it is purely decorative. Here's how the bowl is looking once it's dried. There is a little crack on the section that I had to attach separately, and the clay is just a little bit uneven in spots. So I used a 120 grit sandpaper to smooth it out. I also wanted to clean up all of those slits because the clay dried a little uneven there. Of course, I got a little bit too rough and I broke a section off while sanding, right where that crack was. I was able to glue it back on using some super glue, and then I added some slip to fill in the cracks. And that's it for this piece. I sanded the slip area once it had dried, and I just left the bowl in its natural color like the McGee & Co. inspiration. But you could certainly paint something like this as well.